So friends, in this lecture, we take the discussion of the novel as something, that depicts reality, that becomes a form of reality, that talks about it, that constructs it, that sends out a message through the description of the real to the reader, and starts playing a social role in the literary sphere. And for the discussion, we have our experts, Ms. Nupur Chawla. She teaches English in Maitrey College, Delhi University, and I request her to take it up from there, where the novel shifts interest in the 18th century from romance and starts grappling with the real problems of life. So, welcome, and please begin your lecture.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prakash. Fiction, it's important for us to understand, or novel, in the 18th century onwards started to be seen as distinct from narratives of actual events. So it ceased to be a mere narrativizing of event one after the other, but it started to do something more. It started to add another dimension to reality. It explored the gaps and potentialities in the reality that it was confronting. So this shift from the criticism of the form in the initial stages to an understanding of its complex engagement with reality was a very seminal development in the genre. So this complex engagement, now what do we mean by that? This is completely against the understanding of novel as a mere imitation, but novel doesn't imitate. Instead, it tries to understand by looking at the pitfalls in reality, where is it that we are falling short, what are the possibilities that are kind of dormant right now but can bloom eventually in future. So all these things we see they find expression in the form of the novel. Also, these are certain things these are aspects of reality which we may not be able to understand when we approach reality with a naked eye or when we live it in our day-to-day lives. But when this reality finds expression in the form of the novel, that's when a pattern begins to appear, a pattern begins to emerge, and which then helps us put in perspective the events of which are happening around us. So then novel is no longer a travesty but an increasing emphasis on the fact that it begins to peer below the surface at the underlying truths of the times. And so this view actually flourished further in the 19th century and is very evident in the realistic novels of Tolstoy, Flaubert, Balzac and others. A Hungarian thinker, George Lukács, has responded to or has given us a definition of this new engagement of novel with reality, which is no longer simplistic, it is complex, it is a response to history. He says, true great realism depicts man and society as complete entities. So something which strikes us in this definition is the fact that he connects man and society. He does not think one is separate from the other. B, he talks about this idea of completeness, that they are complete entities when we find them expressed in the novel. So what do we mean by complete? It means that the novel form then looks at all the possible dimensions of an individual or of a reality that is being described or that is being dealt with in the novel. All dimensions would include the negatives, the positives, the confusions, the unanswered parts, those parts which are still in making, those which can make more sense in the future but are in a very nascent form right now. So all these elements of the individual as well as the society together find expression in the form of the novel. The character then is not a flat character anymore. he is a man with ambition. He is deeply rooted in the social reality that surrounds him. He has ambition. He has struggles. He struggles to reach where he dreams to reach. So all these different aspects then are explored in the form of the novel, or in the space that the narrative is provided in the novel. So for the inner, Lukács goes on to again talk about, when he discusses the realistic novel, he says, for the inner life of man, it is essential, its essential traits and conflicts can be truly portrayed only in the organic connection with the society and historical forms. So here he talks about the inner life of man and his essential traits and conflicts, and how man cannot be separated from the society that he is a part of, because it is the surroundings that also shape an individual. The way an individual is impacted by the immediate reality is very, very crucial to understand how a character would then develop. And hence, when we look at this new understanding of this genre, it's very, very important for us to see this kind of a connect between the individual and society.
What I've understood by your definition of the novel, in the 19th century particularly, is that the novel ceases to be a fantasy. The novel ceases to be something unreal. And you started using words like reality and words like express. And you discarded the word imitation. So imitation was that you had seen something elsewhere and then you started imitating it. And in the imitation part, you brought in your own prejudices. But when you are expressing the reality of the time, then you are doing a serious business.
Yeah.
Then the writer is saying something extremely important that will be relevant to the conditions of that surround the reader, and that the reader would be compelled to think.
Yeah.
So novel becomes a serious business in the,
Right.
in the 19th century.
Yeah.
The second thing you also said was that the problems of life, the pains, the predilections, the confusions of life, they also get expression through the novel.
Right.
Which means novel comes quite near the essay form, where the writer is trying to share the sense of pain, the sense of disturbance with the audience, and that the audience stands to learn a great deal from the novel. So what exactly is happening in the 19th century that compels the writer to take this kind of a changed stance, where he says a goodbye to entertainment and starts involving people in the very processes of life in the 19th century? Is there something in the 19th century that compels the writer to take to this kind of a thing?
Yes, I think the coming of the industry, the setting up of factory was, or the system of the factory was one very important development in 19th century. So with this development, then there came a very decisive shift even in the way society operated. For that matter, even in the structure of society. Now society began to have a difference. People started to be differentiated on the basis of the kind of work that they were doing. So somebody who would be working in a factory would have some kind of a subordinate position as against somebody who would be the owner in the factory, or somebody who would be the owner of resources. So this kind of a gap, this kind of a difference then started to give rise to certain dynamics which needed some kind of expression, which needed some kind of an understanding.
Which means that the novel is now responding to a different kind of society.
Right.
Till the 18th century, right from the beginning of humankind's history, let's say 3,000 years ago, when the focus was on the land, on the village, on the church, in the 19th century the focus shifts to production.
Right.
It shifts to people, flocking from the village to the cities, living there in large numbers, organizing their life in a much more complex manner, and facing the heat much more directly than they did earlier.
Correct.
Religion doesn't come to their help, or what they require is their own devices, their own ways to understand things.
Right.
And if they don't understand, then they become angry.
Yes.
And then their anger, creates different kind of situations.
Right.
And the novelist Now, not the poet. The novelist now is engaged with trying to understand this complex process.
Yeah.
So the novel becomes, you use the word very well, I think, this word realism.
Yeah.
This is a word that is self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Something that is real.
Yeah.
And then there is logic behind the real. So what is the logic behind the real? This is what Lukács, in your opinion, would be saying.
Yeah.
That when you reveal the logic of the real through words which are closer to prose than poetry, then it's a novel form.
Right.
And the other thing that you said was narrative. This you didn't use initially, but then you are starting with the word narrative, which means things begin at a certain point.
Yeah.
They might begin in the early 19th century, and they start moving towards complexity. So when they move towards the complexity, then the narrative develops.
Right.
The third thing that you said was, and that also impressed me a great deal, was the introduction of a large number of characters.
Yeah.
So when you have those different kinds of characters, then they will sit down and discuss.
Yeah.
Then they will also quarrel. Then they will also agree or disagree with one another. So the entire social scene comes alive in the longish form called the novel, and that's how novel has progressed. So would you agree with this?
I completely agree with that. The entire society then in that sense comes alive because we now have multiple characters sharing the same space. Each character has his or her own history, has his or her own worldview, has his or her own set of struggles. So when these different individuals come together in one space, we also see some kind of a clash, some kind of a commonality, which then helps us understand the forces or the values which are so very active in society at the time. Like we said, because with the coming of the industry, with the coming of the factories, the relationship that people had also underwent some kind of a change. Some people felt underrepresented or felt that they were not being done justice to, while certain others were enjoying their privileges. So then novel became a form of expression of these people, for these people, capturing their struggles, capturing their immediate experience with the reality. While at the same time, I think it would also give some kind of a perspective in the sense that something that these people would, who are stuck in a particular kind of a circumstance, they may not be able to see a way out, or they may not be able to see where to go from here next. But when this reality finds expression in fiction, we begin to see that way forward. We begin to see an alternate way, an alternate view of the current circumstance, and that's how novel then very actively engages with reality, very actively engages with society, not merely talking about what is going on, but at the same time also showing that what could be. And hence then this becomes a genre which becomes which is very, very so to say educative, if I can use that word with somewhat of a reserve, because educative can also be understood as a novel being didactic, because it was far from being didactic. All that it was doing was it was contributing to an understanding which would be complex, an understanding that would involve factors which were not just visible to the naked eye, but also beyond. So hence history then started to be expressed, found expression in this genre in its all complexity, where different aspects started to find expression, and the reader then started to understand the times better, as against how he would understand them by referring to plain facts or history books. So that's how in fact also we understand that is the enabling part of imagination, that is also the enabling part of fiction, that when reality kind of combines with fiction, or we imaginatively respond to reality, this is what helps us understand those elements of reality better, which then find some kind of a pattern, some kind of a structure in the form of the novel, which otherwise might be difficult to locate in everyday lived reality. So therefore, Lukács also very rightly talks about the ultimate unfolding of the possibilities latent in the current reality. So these possibilities then find expression in the form of the novel.
Let me talk a direct question to you, slightly taking you out of the points that you have made. Suppose you are a history teacher and you are teaching in DU, and students want to know the knowledge of history from you about the French scene in the 19th century. So you have two options. One option is to take to the history book and start explaining to them what happened in the 19th century, and the other is that you refer them to Balzac's novels. So which option would you take?
Most definitely I will take the students to Balzac's novel.
Why?
Because history books talk about a time in terms of hard facts. This happened.
What are hard facts?
Hard facts in the sense
policy
that
statements of the governments, the administrative steps taken by the government, the propaganda that the government indulges in,
yes,
and sets out to the people,
right,
making leaders talk to the audience and taping them and then quoting them.
Yeah.
That is hard facts.
Yeah, that and also where there is a very clear progression shown in events. First this happened, then B happened, then C happened. So what we are told is what happened, but the reasons, the motivations, the why certain things happened are what are the elements that we find missing in history books.
Which means facts by themselves do not make history. So facts in their interconnection make history.
Absolutely.
And those interconnections are established by the novel.
The novel. Most
so therefore you will
definitely.
prefer novels to be read
Yes.
for knowing French history
Yes.
than the history books.
Most definitely. Also, we cannot ignore the element that how when history is written, it can always be written from a certain kind of a biased point of view, where certain events are mentioned and certain other events are deliberately kept out. So
Omission and commission.
absolutely.
You omit certain things and you
Yes.
commit certain things.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
most definitely. So when a student approaches a history book, he would not be aware of what has been omitted or what part of or what selective part of reality has been portrayed. But when the same reality then finds expression in novel, yes, there are certain elements which find more expression than the other, but there is still some kind of an interconnection that we see in different events.
Any example from a novel where there is interconnection which is not there in the history book?
When we think of maybe Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, over there is a mention of how Russia was then transitioning from a society that was driven by the land, by the feudal lords, into a different kind of a setup. The novel then, by means of different characters, so we have a character over there who is very deeply rooted in the traditional form, in the earlier form of society, or the earlier structure of society, and then we have a character who is rooted in the other structure, which is emergent. So over there what we see is a kind of a clash, a kind of a coming together. So the kind of understanding that this kind of a history in process would then give to a student or would give to a reader will be very different from the disconnected facts as found in history books.
Which means the bias that is there in the history book will be taken care of when you present a dialogue between two contending parties.
Yes.
in the novel.
Yes.
So there is a person who presents one point of view, there is another who disagrees with him.
Yes.
And the two clash.
Yeah.
And that kind of a clash is not there in the history book at all.
Exactly.
So the history book is fake
Yeah.
to that extent.
Yeah.
Would you straight away say it or would you say it with a pinch of salt?
I love how you use the word fake, because it is definitely a very strong statement to make nevertheless, but it's important for us to know that, yeah, I mean, history, I would say, is true, or history books I would say are useful, are true to an extent, maybe not questioning their truth, but their usefulness in helping us understand a point of time in the past is only limited. So this can be better understood when the same phenomena, when the same structure is approached in the form of fiction, because when two perspectives clash, we see it's on the reader to see which one would he or she side with. So there is no one, so to say, dominant discourse that would try to influence the reader. It's on the reader to then decide that, okay, these are the two opposite impulses that existed. Which one does he find more justified? Which one does he find more convincing? Will then be on the reader also to understand and interpret. However, at the same time, one might also say that the author can also guide or can also dictate how the reader might understand a circumstance. Yet, at the same time, this kind of domination or this kind of intrusion of the author is not of such a stark characteristic as it would be in the history books. So history books tell you that this is what it is, while the author, even as he might present one view as stronger than the other, yet the presence of the opposite is what makes this form, or is what makes history in fiction more enabling than in history books.
How do you interpret pain in a novel? Because pain means that the author wanted to make the character happy, make the reader happy, make himself also happy, and that didn't happen. So that compulsion of expressing pain, that shows in fact the opposite of what the author may be aiming at. The author wants to present a kind of reality which is digestible, which is acceptable, which is adoptable, but then he finds himself in a dilemma, and he shares the dilemma. Now, sharing the dilemma is not making a statement. Sharing the dilemma means that there are certain things which are beyond the ken of the historian. So the novelist is able to say it.
Yeah.
The historian will not say it.
Very rightly pointed out, actually, that it's the fictional form, it's the space of the fiction then, or the narrative form gives this kind of a space to express even confusions, because the writer is not the be-all and end-all of existence. At the same time, he is not the God who knows the truth. He is also at the same time, just like you and I, he is also an individual who is only trying to understand something that he is representing. So in the process of writing, he is also trying to understand the reality that he is depicting, while the format of a history book would then be wherein the writer of history knows what he is talking about and knows that this is the only reality which existed, and nothing, no scope for confusion, no scope for tentative trends, tentative realities, or tentative ideology or tentative ideas that might exist in society at the moment.
Which means that the life around you, as a novelist, the life around you is compelling you to take a certain stance, and that stance may not be acceptable to the people who fund your research.
Yes.
The history of a time is generally the history of the points of view of the classes that rule.
Yeah.
This is what history books are.
Yeah.
So 19th century history book is written under the influence of the 19th century rulers.
Yeah.
And same might be true about the 20th century also.
Yeah.
The novelist does not work under such disciplines. And at the same time, the novelist also uses the word history.
Right.
Now, for instance, Balzac calls his novels not fiction but history books.
Yeah.
And in the 18th century itself, Fielding calls his novel Tom Jones the history of Tom Jones.
Yeah.
So if they are writing history of Tom Jones, which is a character, then that character is placed in the historical circumstance.
Absolutely.
So would you problematize it further by saying that the emotions, the feelings, the questions, the threats and the challenges of the times are better captured in a novel because it's longish and it brings in lots of characters, or the history books? What is your position on this?
That's correct. That's why I said, like the point that I made even before, that novel then is a very complex engagement with history, as against the history books, which would then give us a particular perspective or would help us look at reality in a particular way. While novel then helps us understand it in the different dimensions that exist in the moment, in the different complexities that exist, those paths which are some paths which are sad, some paths which are to be celebrated, the struggles, the achievements, all of them then together find expression in the novel. So then of course the reader understands that particular time or the situation in a very comprehensive manner, and then I would also say that it's almost comes across as a lived reality. So history then ceases to be a very dry, disconnected set of information. Instead, when it finds expression in novel, it begins to come across as a lived reality, where we see how people felt at a particular point of time, how the kind of emotions that they went through, the kind of relationships they had with other people around them, the kind of family structures that existed, the kind of work structure that existed. So we see a historical moment in active operation in novel as against in a history book.
Any idea towards the end of the lecture, any idea that you'd like to share about that particular form of the novel, which is called the historical novel? There is a form like you mentioned Walter Scott.
Yeah.
He writes about the historical periods.
Yeah.
And he sometimes brings in also the historical characters.
Right.
So would you say something briefly about Walter Scott's kind of writing?
Yes, definitely. So the historical novel actually had at the center the fact that it was based on a historical figure or a particular historical event. It was responding to that individual or that particular event in particular. So that's how that's what distinguished the historical novel, say, from any other type of novel like a picaresque novel or an epistolary form of novel. So these were the different types then eventually which eventually emerged as this genre developed.
Now say it in 2 sentences of the point that you have made in the lecture.
So we need to understand that how important the idea of reality is when we approach the genre of novel. In its development, in its course, initially it was a suspect as something away from reality, as something which had escapist elements. As we moved ahead into 18th and 19th centuries, this understanding underwent a shift, where there was no longer this kind of a criticism of the genre, but it began to be looked at a form which engaged with reality in a very complex manner, was a kind of a comprehensive response to the situations around.
So friends, with this discussion we come to the end of the lecture, and the points that have been made, they can be further studied with help from other novels that you might have read or might refer to. Thanks.